Drew, let's talk about Alabama. Kalen DeBoer, they're heating up. They're up to number 13 in the 24/7 Sports Composite Team rankings. This was a question, right? I think everybody knew Kalen DeBoer could coach. Nobody really questioned that. Washington, coming off the heels of a national championship run, Kalen DeBoer hired at Alabama. That was the big looming question. Kind of felt a little bit like Brian Kelly coming from Notre Dame to LSU. Is he going to be able to get the job done when it comes to recruiting? Well, Drew, so far, so good. And I think a little bit of this comes from the fact that there's a microscope on Kalen DeBoer right now in Tuscaloosa in terms, is he going to be able to get this done? How about this? Over the weekend, pair of commitments, and we'll start with top 247 receiver Derek Smith, in-state product. We'll talk about him here in a minute. And Zamir Smith as well, number 14 athlete in the country, number 6 player in the state of Maryland. Drew a couple crystal balls for the Tide too. Darrell Johnson was a guy that was trending towards Florida State. Looks like Alabama's in the driver's seat there. Top 247 linebacker. And then 3-star linebacker Luke Metz from Mill Creek in Georgia. So a couple Georgia prospects that Alabama's looking good for. But Drew, just your take, I guess, on the momentum that Kalen DeBoer and the rest of his crew is kind of spinning up right now.
I mean, you love to see it, right? Derek Smith, top 100 talent in the top 247. You listed him as build him as a wide receiver. You know, tons of smoke out there that he might also, or could play on the defensive side of the ball, Coop. And I'll be honest, went back in, broke him down. Kid we saw at the Future 50 back in the summer with the wide receivers. I kind of love him on defense as like a box low safety. You watch the tape. Strikes people as a tackler, can track the football. But then as a wide receiver, not the most polished, I would say, of the wide receiver prospects in the top 247. But after the catch, that short area burst shows up. So I think it's a big pickup for the Crimson Tide. And then they go into Maryland. And I think, Coop, I was kind of wondering to myself, right, what is going to be the recruiting footprint for this Kalen DeBoer-led Alabama program, right? Are they going to focus on the South? Are we going to see them kind of like when Brian Kelly first took over at LSU, go back to some of the guys they were targeting at when he was at Washington, much like Brian Kelly did when he was at Notre Dame. And then out of nowhere in Maryland, they go up and they pick up Zaire Smith. And we need to point out these kids are not related, okay? Derek Smith, Zaire Smith, they're not related. Just both carry the same last name. And then you pop on the tape of Zaire Smith, man, two-way player, does most of his damage at running back. And it appears, or it sounds like the Crimson Tide are going to use him on the defensive side of the ball, and I can definitely see it. Not a ton of verified information out there on Zaire Smith, but the tape certainly pops. So I love these two pickups, and it feels like Alabama to me. I don't know about you, Coop. Like they are taking the. I used to say this was Saban. They would take the car out of the garage and put it in drive. We're seeing a little bit of that, and it's been a while since there's been Alabama kind of buzz, right? We've been to events. Alabama hasn't been mentioned much, and now you look, they're 13 in the rankings, a little stretch of commitments, and I would assume that's going to continue as we progress through these month of March, April, into May.
I like the geography here, right? Like if you're following the cookie crumbs a little bit, I like the fact that you get a really good in-state player in Derek Smith. You mentioned the two-way ability. I like that a lot. I think the other thing is, if you think about Alabama, they have for a long time under Nick Saban, kind of had their hands in the DMV. They have always been active in that area. So to go out there and get a guy like Zamir Smith, I think that says a lot. And then the two other guys that they're trending for, Darrell Johnson, right, out of the state of Georgia, and Luke Metz as well, out of Mill Creek. I think that's important. So they haven't really strayed far from what's been the traditional geographical footprint, which I don't want to say was really ever in question, but it's been pretty interesting to kind of see Alabama continue to kind of follow the traditional recruiting routes, at least geographically. Drew, the other question I asked myself when it came to Alabama and Kalen DeBoer, if you were to evaluate this class and then look at it through the lens of ask yourself this question, if this was Nick Saban sitting in the high chair in Tuscaloosa and not Kalen DeBoer, how would you evaluate this class?
I think these are Saban-esque takes, right? Those two so far. I mean, it's still early. There was a ton of defections for Alabama in that 2025 class. I think when Nick Saban, rode off into the sunset, I thought they were in position to potentially sign a number one group, a greatest of all time type of group, depending on how the rankings, fizzled out and how all that played out. But it was a talented group to me. I mean, Derek Smith, again, both these guys, height, weight, speed. I think the tape shows up. Where do you stand on Derek Smith? I got to ask you that. Are you offense or defense? You're going to say offense.
I'm more offense, at least because that's what I've been exposed to recently. But I like Derek Smith. I mean, you think about a guy, 6'1", 3/4, going to be well over 200 pounds when he gets to campus on Saturdays. And you think about his ability. The more I watch him, Andrew, the more I like him. I mean, you think about his versatility. Sure, he's playing a lower level of competition at Selma, but you think about him being utilized out of the backfield. This is a guy that had over 1,400 yards receiving, had another 1,000 yards on the ground, had 11 sacks on defense. I went back to the Future 50 tape in June of last year. He's pretty raw, but there's some things that he does on tape that didn't necessarily show up in a combine setting. So I think there's a lot to be excited about in terms of the upside and the developmental upside of the athlete that has yet to materialize. So I'm not hell-bent one way or the other, whether it's going to be offense or defense, but I see a really fun player that's position versatile, that's probably going to take a year or two, quite honestly, to kind of get his feet under him. But I like to take a lot, man. We got him at, 68, 69 right now, number 8 receiver in the country. Hudson Standish kind of brought up the point. He's kind of Draylon Miller-esque. I think he's a little bit bigger, a little bit more physical. I'm excited, man, because the other thing that came to my mind, these guys are very different styles of players. But in terms of how creative Kalen DeBoer is, he utilized Rome Odunze a lot out of the backfield, just in terms of finding creative ways to get the ball in his hands. I like that for Kalen DeBoer. And listen, I like the job that they're doing at the receiver position. I thought Jamarcus Shepard is one of the best hires. And although it was a layup, that's a really good hire. And obviously you're starting to see the dividends of that already.
Well, we don't have to nerd out too much on Alabama and Derek Smith. The last thing I'll say is I went into that Future 50 combine footage as well. I thought he fought the football a little bit. And he put on the highlight tape, right? You said at 1,400 receiving yards. Like, how many of those are after the catch? It's not like he's catching a bunch of, deep shots. I mean, he is escaping tackles in traffic, turning it upfield. I think the biggest thing for Derek Smith, if he is going to play offense, all right, can he work a full route tree, which you can coach him up to do. And he hasn't been exposed to that at Southside there at Selma High School. And the final thing I wrote down, special teams ace, right? This is a guy that's going to come in and potentially, year 1, year 2, he's going to be on kickoff. He can be a gunner. And I think as you construct the roster, especially in this era, you need to find some of those individuals. So like that other thing, Daryl Johnson, right? You're kind of darling, top 50 linebacker for us out of Georgia, two-way player, basketball player. It seemed like Florida State was involved there. I don't know where Georgia stands in his recruitment. Coop, I was thinking about it this morning. All right, Alabama takes Keon Saab as a safety. I'm not saying Daryl Johnson is Keon Saab, but they are kind of built kind of similar. So interested to see, all right, let's say Daryl Johnson commits to the Crimson Tide. They pick up that pledge. How does Keon Saab get utilized in that defense here in 2024? Because I think there's a chance you could deploy Daryl Johnson in a similar way.
I see the synergy there in terms of the player comparison and what you are, I guess, suggesting between Daryl Johnson and Keon Sabb. I think Sabb is more of a third safety boundary type of role. I think Daryl Johnson's going to be one of those guys ultimately at the end of the day is going to play around 230 pounds, is going to be a second-level defender that you can also utilize off the edge. I mean, you talk about raw prospects, and I'm not saying this as a negative. Both Derek Smith and Daryl Johnson are really, really good athletes. But in terms of the fundamentals of the game, I think, Daryl Johnson, when we saw him in person at Under Armour Atlanta in February, was just kind of like this guy that didn't understand speed and space yet. That short area, right? He had not developed that instinct. And that's something that comes with a lot of reps. I said this, somebody pushed back, I think in the chat a couple of weeks ago. Sometimes when you are the best athlete on the field playing at a lower level of competition, it can hurt your development. Ultimately, not at the end of the day long term, but it can hurt your development in maybe that 2 to 3 year window. What I mean by that is Daryl Johnson's playing everything. He's playing running back. He's playing quarterback. He's playing receiver. He's playing off the edge. He's playing safety. He's playing corner. So what I mean by that is you talk about being able to develop instincts and that kind of sense of awareness. Well, you have to play the position that you're ultimately going to play long term. That's not what it is short term.